My son-in-law used a twisted ankle to convince my own daughter I was incompetent, all so he could sell the farm my wife and I had built over a lifetime. He saw me as a helpless old man, a problem to be managed and relocated. He didn't know my wife Emma had seen his greed from beyond the grave. And before she died, she left me one final, devastating gift, a perfectly legal, devastating trap, designed to teach anyone who mistook my age for weakness the true meaning of consequences. If you believe a lifetime of work deserves to be protected, hit subscribe so you never miss the final verdict. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, the story begins. The trouble started 3 weeks after Emma's funeral, when Brad began asking questions about maintaining the farm that he'd never cared about during the 47 years Emma and I had worked this land together. "Frank, this is a lot of property for one person to manage," my son-in-law said during Sunday dinner at Sarah's house. 200 acres, that old farmhouse, all those outbuildings. Are you sure you can handle it all by yourself? I looked at Brad across the table where my daughter served the pot roast Emma used to make every Sunday for 38 years. Brad was wearing his real estate agent smile, the one I'd seen him use with clients when he thought he'd found their weak spot. "I've been farming this land since before you were born, Brad. I think I can manage a while longer," I told him. "But Dad, you're 73 years old," Sarah said, her voice carrying the worried tone she'd been using since Emma's death. "What if something happens and no one's around to help?" What if? The same hypothetical disasters that people use to justify taking control of other people's lives. I'd been hearing variations of this conversation from well-meaning neighbors for months. "I have the Hendersons next door, the volunteer fire department, and a cell phone that works just fine," I said to Sarah. "I'm not some helpless old man wandering around in his underwear." Brad leaned forward with the concerned expression he used when he was about to make what he thought was a reasonable suggestion. "Frank, Sarah and I have been talking about this. We think it might be time to consider some lifestyle changes that would give you more security and less responsibility," Brad said. "What kind of lifestyle changes?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. "Assisted living facilities have come a long way in recent years. Beautiful communities with activities, social interaction, medical care when you need it," Sarah said. "You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining the farm or being isolated out there by yourself." "And what happens to the farm while I'm enjoying all this social interaction?" I asked. Brad's expression didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes that looked like anticipation rather than concern. "Well, that's something we'd need to discuss as a family. The property has significant value that could fund your care for decades," he said. There it was, the real reason for this sudden interest in my welfare. Brad was calculating how much money my farm could generate if I was conveniently relocated to institutional care. "Brad, Emma, and I bought this farm for $18,000 in 1976. We raised Sarah here, built our life here, planned to live here until one of us died," I said. "I'm not interested in selling it to pay for the privilege of living somewhere else." "Dad, nobody's talking about selling anything right now," Sarah said quickly. "We're just discussing options for making sure you're safe and well cared for." But I'd seen the look that passed between Sarah and Brad when I mentioned the farm's value. They'd already been discussing those options, and I hadn't been included in the conversation. "I appreciate your concern," I said to both of them, "but I'm not ready to abandon the place Emma and I built together just because other people think I'm too old to live independently." The conversation ended there, but I could feel the issue hanging in the air like smoke from the burn piles Emma used to tend every fall. Over the next few weeks, Brad's visits to the farm became more frequent and more focused on what he called safety assessments. He'd point out loose boards on the front porch, gutters that needed cleaning, or fence posts that were starting to lean. "Frank, this place is becoming a liability," Brad said during one of his inspections. "What if someone gets hurt because you didn't maintain the property properly?" "Brad, I've been maintaining this property longer than you've been alive. A few loose boards don't constitute a safety crisis," I replied. "But what about insurance liability, property taxes, utilities for a house this size?" Brad pressed. "The expenses are going to eat up your retirement income." I'd been managing those expenses successfully for decades, but Brad was building a case that my competence was declining and my situation was becoming unsustainable. The campaign intensified after I had a minor accident in the barn. I was moving hay bales when I slipped and twisted my ankle, nothing more serious than the kind of injury that happens to anyone who works with their hands for a living. But within hours of Sarah helping me ice the ankle, Brad was at my door with forms from 3 different assisted living facilities. "Frank, this is exactly what we've been worried about," Brad said, spreading brochures across Emma's kitchen table. "You're working alone with heavy equipment and dangerous conditions. Next time, you might not be so lucky." Looking at those glossy brochures scattered across the table where Emma and I had eaten breakfast together for 47 years, I realized that Brad wasn't concerned about my safety. He was documenting incidents he could use to build a case that I was no longer competent to live independently. "Brad, farmers have been getting minor injuries since farming was invented. One twisted ankle doesn't mean I need institutional care," I said. "But Dad, what if it had been worse? What if you'd broken a hip or hit your head?" Sarah asked. "We'd never forgive ourselves if something serious happened because we didn't take precautions." Sarah's concern was genuine, but it was being manipulated by Brad's agenda. My daughter loved me and wanted me to be safe, which made her vulnerable to someone who was using her fears to justify his financial schemes. That evening, I called my granddaughter Katie at college. She was studying agriculture at the state university, planning to return to farming after graduation, and she understood both the land and the people who worked it. "Grandpa, how are you doing out there?" Katie asked. "Mom's been calling me about some kind of accident in the barn." I twisted my ankle moving hay. "Your mother and Brad are acting like I nearly died," I told Katie. "That doesn't sound like you. You're the most careful person I know when it comes to farm work," Katie said. "What's really going on?" I explained about Brad's sudden interest in my living arrangements, his safety assessments, and the assisted living brochures that had appeared after every minor incident or maintenance issue. Katie was quiet for a moment before responding. "Grandpa, Brad's been asking Mom a lot of questions about the farm's value, market prices, development potential, stuff like that," she said. "What kind of questions?" I asked Katie. "He wanted to know how much farmland in our county was selling for, whether the property would be more valuable for residential development, and who would inherit it if something happened to you," Katie said. The picture was becoming clear. Brad wasn't concerned about my welfare. He was conducting market research on the asset he was planning to liquidate as soon as he could convince Sarah that I needed institutional care. "Katie, what did your mother say when Brad asked those questions?" I asked. "She told him that Grandma Emma had handled most of the legal stuff and that you'd never talked about selling the farm," Katie said. "But Grandpa, Brad's been pushing her to ask you about estate planning and financial arrangements." After I hung up, I sat in Emma's chair by the front window, looking out at the fields we'd cultivated together for nearly 5 decades. The corn was coming in strong this year, the way it always did when we'd had the right balance of rain and sunshine. But I was beginning to understand that Brad saw those productive fields differently than Emma and I had. Where we saw the culmination of decades of careful stewardship, he saw real estate inventory waiting to be converted to cash. The next morning, I made a decision that Emma would have supported. I drove to town and made an appointment with James Crawford, the attorney who'd handled our legal affairs since 1982. If Brad wanted to play games with safety assessments and competency evaluations, I needed to understand exactly what legal protections Emma and I had established to prevent our life's work from being stolen by people who saw it as a financial opportunity rather than a family legacy. As I pulled into James's parking lot, I realized that this wasn't just about maintaining my independence or protecting the farm from Brad's schemes. It was about honoring the trust Emma had placed in me to preserve what we'd built together. And if that trust required me to outmaneuver a son-in-law who mistook my age for weakness, then I'd show him the difference between growing old and growing stupid. James Crawford's office hadn't changed much since Emma and I first walked through its doors in 1982 to set up our wills and estate planning. The same oak furniture, the same law books lining the walls, the same sense that important decisions were made here by people who understood the weight of protecting what families had built over generations. "Frank, I'm sorry for your loss," James said as we settled into the leather chairs where Emma and I had planned for a future that assumed we'd grow old together. "Emma was a remarkable woman, and I know this transition has been difficult." "Thank you, James. But I'm here because the transition is becoming more complicated than I expected," I told him. I explained Brad's sudden concern about my living arrangements, his safety assessments, and the assisted living brochures that appeared after every minor incident on the farm. James listened with the careful attention of someone who'd seen family dynamics turn ugly over valuable property. "Frank, what specifically concerns you about Brad's behavior?" he asked. "He's not interested in my safety. He's interested in liquidating my farm to solve problems I don't know about yet," I said to James. "What makes you think Brad has financial problems?" James asked. My granddaughter Katie overheard him asking detailed questions about the farm's market value, development potential, and inheritance arrangements, I explained. James pulled out a thick folder labeled Morrison Family Trust and spread documents across his desk. "Frank, before we discuss Brad's motives, I need to remind you of some arrangements Emma made that you might have forgotten," he said. The documents James showed me took my breath away. Emma had been far more thorough in protecting our farm than I'd realized during her final illness. "Your wife established an irrevocable family trust 3 years ago that holds title to all your agricultural property," James explained. "The farm can't be sold without specific conditions being met, and those conditions were designed to prevent exactly what you're describing." I stared at legal language that Emma had crafted with the foresight of someone who understood that valuable farmland makes some people think more about money than about family legacy. "James, I remember signing papers during Emma's illness, but I thought they were just updating our wills," I said. "Emma was very specific about wanting additional protections beyond standard estate planning," James said. "She was concerned that pressure might be applied to you after her death to sell the farm for financial reasons that didn't serve your interests or honor your life's work." Emma had seen this coming. Somehow, my wife had anticipated that her death would make me vulnerable to manipulation by people who viewed our farm as a financial asset rather than a family heritage. "What exactly does the trust prevent?" I asked James. "The farm cannot be sold, developed, or transferred to anyone other than Katie, unless you're declared mentally incompetent by a court after extensive medical evaluation," James explained. "And even then, the trust includes provisions that would make such proceedings very difficult to pursue successfully." James showed me clauses that Emma had insisted on including. If anyone attempted to have me declared incompetent for financial gain, the trust would automatically transfer the farm to Katie and establish a charitable foundation that would preserve it as agricultural land in perpetuity. "Emma also included specific language about Brad," James continued. "If your son-in-law attempts to pressure you into selling the farm or moving to institutional care, he loses any potential claim to benefiting from the property, even through Sarah's inheritance." My wife had been protecting me from a threat she'd recognized before I'd even understood it existed. Emma had seen Brad's character more clearly than I had and prepared legal defenses against exactly the manipulation I was now experiencing. "James, how did Emma know to include provisions about Brad specifically?" I asked. "She mentioned that Brad had made several comments during her illness about the farm's value and your ability to maintain it as you aged," James said. Emma was concerned that he saw the property as a financial opportunity rather than a family legacy. I thought back to Emma's final months, when she'd spent hours in this office while I'd assumed she was just updating routine paperwork. She'd actually been building legal fortifications to protect our life's work from the greed she'd detected in our son-in-law. "Frank, there's something else Emma included that you should know about," James said, pulling out another document. "If Brad escalates his pressure campaign or attempts to have you declared incompetent, the trust authorizes you to take specific defensive actions." The document outlined strategies Emma had prepared for exposing and countering manipulation attempts. Financial investigations into anyone pressuring me to sell, competency evaluations conducted by doctors she'd pre-selected, and legal procedures for documenting harassment or coercion. "Your wife anticipated that Brad might use Sarah's concern for your welfare as leverage to achieve his financial goals," James explained. "She prepared tools to help you defend yourself while protecting Sarah from being manipulated into betraying her own father." That evening, I sat in Emma's chair reading through the trust documents she'd created to preserve our farm and my independence. Her handwriting filled the margins with notes about protecting family assets from people who mistake opportunity for obligation. The next morning, Brad arrived unannounced with a clipboard and measuring tape, claiming he needed to document safety hazards for insurance purposes. "Frank, I've been thinking about our conversation last week," Brad said as he photographed loose boards and measured distances between handrails. "Sarah's really worried about you living out here alone, and I think we need to make some concrete plans." "What kind of concrete plans?" I asked Brad. "Well, I've researched some excellent assisted living communities within an hour's drive, places where you'd have medical support, social activities, and maintenance-free living," Brad said. He pulled out brochures from Sunset Manor, the same facility I'd noticed he'd circled in red ink on the pricing sheets. The most expensive option available, coincidentally. "Brad, these places cost $4,000 a month." "That's more than I spend on everything combined living here," I said. "But Frank, That's why we'd need to liquidate some assets to fund your care, Brad replied. The farm could provide enough equity to cover your expenses for decades. There it was again, the casual assumption that selling my farm was an obvious solution to a problem he was creating through his pressure campaign. Brad, I'm not interested in liquidating anything. I'm interested in continuing to live in the house Emma and I built together, I said. Frank, you're being unrealistic about your situation. This property is becoming a liability you can't afford to maintain, Brad said. His tone was shifting from concern to impatience. I've been maintaining this property successfully for 47 years, I replied. But you're not the same person you were even 5 years ago. Emma handled a lot of the decision-making and financial management you're trying to handle alone now, Brad said. That was completely untrue. Emma had managed household finances, but I'd always handled farm operations, equipment maintenance, and property management. Brad was inventing incompetencies to justify his scheme. Brad, Emma never handled farm management. That was always my responsibility, I corrected him. Frank, I don't think you remember clearly how things were divided between you and Emma, Brad said. Memory problems are common at your age, especially after the stress of losing a spouse. Brad was gaslighting me, trying to make me doubt my own recollections about how Emma and I had shared responsibilities during our marriage. That afternoon, I called Katie and told her about Brad's documentation project and his claims about Emma handling farm management. Grandpa, that's ridiculous. Grandma always said you knew more about farming than anyone in the county, Katie said. She handled the household budget and you handled everything related to the farm. Brad's lying to you. Katie, I need you to do something for me, but you have to keep it between us for now, I said. What do you need, Grandpa? Katie asked. I explained what I'd learned about Emma's trust and Brad's financial motivations. I need you to find out more about Brad's situation, why he needs money badly enough to steal a farm from his wife's father, I said. Over the next week, Katie used her connections and research skills to uncover information about Brad that explained his desperate behavior. Grandpa, Brad's real estate business is failing, Katie said during one of our evening phone calls. He owes money to investors, banks, and suppliers. His house is in foreclosure, and he's been borrowing against Sarah's credit cards. How much money is he talking about? I asked Katie. Over $200,000 in combined debts. Mom doesn't know about most of it because Brad's been hiding the worst problems from her, Katie said. The scope of Brad's financial crisis explained his timeline and his tactics. He wasn't just opportunistic, he was desperate. My farm represented his only hope of avoiding bankruptcy and losing everything he'd built through years of poor business decisions. Katie, has Brad said anything to your mother about timelines for getting me into assisted living? I asked. He's been pushing her to have you evaluated by a geriatric specialist who could document your declining capacity to live independently, Katie said. Brad's scheme was becoming more sophisticated and more dangerous. He wasn't just pressuring me to move, he was building a medical case that I was incompetent to make my own decisions about housing and property management. But Emma had anticipated exactly this escalation and prepared legal countermeasures that would teach Brad the difference between exploiting someone's grief and stealing their life's work. The next phase of his education was about to begin, whether he was ready for it or not. Armed with knowledge of Emma's trust and Brad's desperate financial situation, I spent the next week implementing the defensive strategies my wife had prepared for exactly this scenario. First, I scheduled appointments with the 3 doctors Emma had pre-selected for competency evaluations, all of them specialists in geriatric medicine who understood the difference between normal aging and actual cognitive decline. Mr. Morrison, your wife contacted me 2 years ago about potential future evaluations, Dr. Patricia Hayes explained during my appointment at her clinic downtown. She was concerned that family members might question your mental capacity for financial reasons rather than medical ones. Dr. Hayes conducted comprehensive tests of my memory, reasoning, and decision-making abilities. The evaluation took 3 hours and covered everything from farm management decisions to financial planning to household maintenance routines. Mr. Morrison, you demonstrate completely normal cognitive function for your age, Dr. Hayes said when the testing was complete. Your memory is sharp, your reasoning is sound, and your judgment appears excellent. I see no medical justification for questioning your ability to live independently or manage your own affairs. Dr. Hayes provided written documentation that would be crucial if Brad escalated his campaign to have me declared incompetent. Emma had been thorough in preparing medical evidence that would counter any fraudulent claims about my mental state. The second defense Emma had prepared was financial. James Crawford had authorized a private investigator to document Brad's debt situation and business failures, creating a paper trail that would expose his true motivations if he continued pressuring me to sell the farm. "Frank, your wife was remarkably prescient about Brad's character," the investigator, Michael Torres, reported when he delivered his findings. Brad Webb owes $230,000 to various creditors. His real estate license is under review for ethics violations, and he's been borrowing money from clients' escrow accounts. The last detail made my stomach turn. Brad hadn't just been making poor business decisions, he'd been stealing from clients to fund his failing operations. My farm represented his last chance to avoid criminal charges and financial ruin. "Michael, how long before Brad's situation becomes public knowledge?" I asked. "He's got maybe 2 months before creditors start filing lawsuits and clients discover they're missing escrow funds," Michael said. "That explains his urgency about getting you into assisted living and liquidating your property." That evening, Brad arrived with Sarah for what he called a serious family conversation about your future, Frank. They sat across from me in the living room where Emma and I had raised Sarah, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and planned for retirement years we'd thought we'd share together. "Dad, Brad's been researching the costs of maintaining this farm versus the benefits of transitioning to assisted living," Sarah said. She was carrying a folder thick with financial projections and care facility brochures. "We're not trying to pressure you, but we want you to understand the reality of your situation," Brad said, spreading documents across Emma's coffee table. The documents were impressive in their detail and completely fraudulent in their assumptions. Brad had inflated maintenance costs, underestimated farm income, and calculated living expenses based on luxury assisted living facilities that cost twice as much as necessary. "According to these projections, you'll be bankrupt within 3 years if you try to maintain the farm independently," Brad said. "But if you sell the property and move to Sunset Manor, you'll have financial security for the rest of your life." "Brad, these numbers don't match my actual expenses from the past 5 years," I said, pointing to categories where he'd doubled or tripled real costs. "Frank, you're not accounting for increasing maintenance needs as the property ages, or for your decreasing ability to handle repairs yourself," Brad replied. "These projections are realistic about future challenges you're not anticipating." Sarah leaned forward with the earnest expression of someone delivering difficult but necessary news. "Dad, we've also found a geriatric specialist who can evaluate whether living alone is still safe for you," she said. "What kind of evaluation?" I asked Sarah. "Dr. Harrison at the Sunset Manor Medical Center. He specializes in assessing elderly people's capacity to live independently," Brad said. "Just a routine evaluation to document your current abilities and identify any areas where you might need additional support." I recognized the name from Emma's notes about doctors to avoid. Dr. Harrison had a reputation for finding incompetence in elderly patients whose families needed medical justification for transferring them to expensive care facilities. "Brad, I've already been evaluated by 3 different doctors in the past 2 weeks. All of them found me completely competent to live independently and manage my own affairs," I said. Brad's confident expression flickered with surprise and concern. "You had medical evaluations? Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. "Because I wanted objective professional opinions about my competency, not evaluations designed to reach predetermined conclusions," I replied. I handed Sarah copies of the competency reports Dr. Hayes and her colleagues had prepared. Detailed medical documentation that I was mentally sharp, physically capable, and fully qualified to make my own decisions about housing and property management. Sarah read through the reports with growing confusion and relief. "Dad, these doctors say you're doing fine, that there's no medical reason you can't continue living here," she said. "That's right. Which makes me wonder why Brad has been so insistent that I need institutional care," I said, looking directly at my son-in-law. Brad's face was reddening, but he maintained his concerned demeanor. "Frank, I'm just trying to help you plan realistically for challenges that might develop as you get older," he said. "Brad, what challenges are you expecting that require selling my farm immediately?" I pressed. "Property maintenance, emergency repairs, medical emergencies when no one's around to help," Brad replied. "This place is becoming a liability you can't afford to maintain." It was time to reveal what Emma had prepared for exactly this moment. I pulled out the trust documents James Crawford had given me and spread them across the coffee table next to Brad's fraudulent financial projections. Brad, I think you should know that Emma established legal protections to prevent exactly what you've been trying to do, I said. Sarah picked up the trust papers with curiosity that quickly turned to shock as she read Emma's provisions about protecting the farm from pressure to sell for financial reasons. Dad, Mom put the farm in a trust? When did this happen? Sarah asked. The farm cannot be sold or transferred except under very specific conditions that Emma designed to prevent exactly the kind of pressure campaign Brad has been conducting, I continued. Brad tried to maintain his composure, but his voice was strained. Frank, I'm not conducting any kind of campaign. I'm trying to help you make practical decisions about your future, he said. Brad, you've been documenting minor incidents to build a case that I'm incompetent. You've been inflating costs and deflating income to make the farm seem financially unsustainable. You've been pushing Sarah to have me evaluated by a doctor with a reputation for finding incompetence in elderly patients whose families need them declared unfit, I said. I pulled out Michael Torres's investigation report and handed it to Sarah. Most importantly, you've been hiding the fact that you owe over $200,000 to creditors and need money from my farm to avoid bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for misappropriating client funds. Sarah read the investigator's report with growing horror and understanding. Her husband hadn't been concerned about my welfare. He'd been planning to steal my life's work to solve financial problems he'd created through years of poor decisions and ethical violations. Brad, is this true? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brad's careful facade finally cracked completely. Sarah, the debts are temporary setbacks. The real estate market has been challenging, but selling your father's farm would solve our financial problems and provide security for everyone, he said. Security for everyone, or just for you? I asked Brad. Frank, you can't live in that farmhouse forever. Eventually you'll need care that we can't provide while managing our own financial obligations, Brad replied. So you decided to create a crisis that would justify stealing my farm before I actually needed any care, I said. Sarah stood up and walked to the window overlooking the fields where Emma and I had grown corn and soybeans for 4 decades. Brad, you've been lying to me about Dad's condition and about your business problems, she said without turning around. I've been protecting you from stress you didn't need while trying to solve problems that affect our entire family, Brad replied. By stealing from my father, Sarah said. She turned back to face her husband with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a teenager caught in a serious lie. Sarah, I never intended to steal anything. I intended to help your father transition to appropriate care while preserving family assets, Brad said. By liquidating the farm Emma and I spent our lives building so you could pay off gambling debts and embezzled client funds, I corrected. The confrontation that followed was painful but necessary. Sarah learning that her husband had been manipulating her love for me to justify stealing my property. Brad finally admitting that his concern for my welfare was secondary to his need for money to avoid financial and legal consequences. By the time they left that evening, Sarah understood that her marriage was built on lies, and her father was the target of systematic theft disguised as family concern. But Emma's trust had protected both the farm and my independence from someone who'd mistake my grief for weakness and my age for incompetence. Brad's education about the difference between opportunity and theft was about to become considerably more expensive. 2 weeks after the confrontation at my house, Brad made his final desperate move. Sarah had moved back in with me temporarily while she processed the revelation that her marriage had been built on lies and theft, but Brad wasn't giving up on his scheme to liquidate my farm. The call came at 7 in the morning, waking me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had since Emma's death. Frank, this is Dr. Harrison from Sunset Manor Medical Center, a voice said. I need to schedule an emergency competency evaluation based on concerns raised by your family. I was fully awake now. What concerns and which family members? I asked Dr. Harrison. Your son-in-law has documented incidents suggesting cognitive decline and unsafe living conditions. State law requires immediate evaluation when family members report potential self-neglect or diminished capacity, Dr. Harrison said. Brad had triggered the nuclear option. He was attempting to have me declared mentally incompetent through emergency proceedings that could result in forced institutionalization before I could mount a legal defense. Dr. Harrison, I was evaluated by 3 different specialists 2 weeks ago, all of whom found me completely competent. I'll send you copies of those reports immediately, I said. Mr. Morrison, emergency evaluations take precedence over routine assessments. I need to see you today to document your current mental state and living conditions, Dr. Harrison insisted. After hanging up, I called James Crawford with news that Emma's worst-case scenario was unfolding exactly as she'd anticipated. Frank, Brad's filing for emergency guardianship based on fabricated medical claims, James said after I described Dr. Harrison's call. But Emma prepared for this exact situation. The trust includes automatic triggers that activate when fraudulent competency proceedings are initiated. James explained that Brad's desperation had triggered legal mechanisms Emma had built into the trust specifically to punish anyone who attempted to steal my farm through false medical claims. If the court determines that competency proceedings were filed for financial gain rather than genuine medical concern, the trust automatically transfers the farm to Katie and establishes criminal penalties for whoever filed the fraudulent petition, James said. That afternoon, Dr. Harrison arrived at my farm with a court order authorizing him to conduct an emergency competency evaluation. He was accompanied by a social worker and a sheriff's deputy, making it clear that Brad had convinced someone in authority that I posed an immediate danger to myself. Mr. Morrison, I need to assess your living conditions and mental state based on family reports of declining capacity, Dr. Harrison said as he photographed my kitchen, living room, and the minor maintenance issues Brad had documented during his previous visits. The evaluation was professionally conducted but clearly designed to find problems that would justify institutionalization. Dr. Harrison asked leading questions about my ability to manage medications, remember appointments, and maintain household cleanliness. Mr. Morrison, your family reports that you've been forgetting to eat meals and neglecting personal hygiene, Dr. Harrison said while taking notes. Doctor, I've been eating 3 meals a day and showering regularly since Emma died 6 months ago. My family member who reported those concerns has financial motivations for having me declared incompetent, I replied. Dr. Harrison dismissed my explanation with the practiced indifference of someone who'd heard similar claims from dozens of elderly patients whose families sought control of their assets. But Emma had prepared for exactly this scenario. I handed Dr. Harrison the competency reports from the 3 specialists Emma had pre-selected, along with documentation of Brad's debts and business failures that explained his true motivations. Doctor, before you submit your evaluation, you should know that emergency guardianship proceedings based on fraudulent medical claims trigger automatic criminal penalties under the trust that governs this property, I said. Dr. Harrison reviewed Emma's legal documentation with growing concern. The trust included provisions that would make him personally liable for participating in fraudulent competency evaluations if he couldn't provide legitimate medical justification for his findings. Mr. Morrison, I'll need to review these documents with my supervisor before submitting my report, Dr. Harrison said, his confidence evaporating as he understood the legal consequences Emma had prepared for anyone who participated in Brad's scheme. That evening, Brad appeared at my door with legal documents and the desperate expression of someone whose final gambit was failing. Frank, I've filed papers with the county court requesting emergency guardianship based on Dr. Harrison's preliminary findings, Brad said. Sarah will be appointed as your guardian, which means she'll have legal authority to make decisions about your housing and property management. The audacity was breathtaking. Brad was still trying to use Sarah's love for me as a weapon to steal my farm, even after she'd discovered his lies and moved out of their house. Brad, Sarah knows about your debts, your business failures, and your plan to steal my farm. She's not going to help you liquidate my property to pay off your gambling debts and embezzled client funds, I said. Frank, this isn't about money. This is about getting you appropriate care before you hurt yourself or someone else, Brad replied, but his voice lacked the conviction he'd maintained during earlier conversations. Brad, 3 independent medical specialists have documented that I'm completely competent to live independently and manage my own affairs. Dr. Harrison's emergency evaluation was based on lies you told about my condition, I said. Brad's facade finally cracked completely. Frank, I owe money to people who don't accept excuses or payment plans. If I can't raise $200,000 within the next month, I'm going to prison and Sarah's going to lose everything we built together, he said. So you decided to steal my farm to solve problems you created through gambling and embezzling client money, I replied. I decided to help you transition to appropriate care while preserving family assets that could benefit everyone, Brad said, still trying to frame theft as family planning. Brad, the farm isn't family assets, it's my property, protected by a trust my wife established specifically to prevent people like you from stealing it during vulnerable times, I said. I pulled out the final document Emma had prepared for exactly this moment, a legal notification that anyone who attempted fraudulent guardianship proceedings against me would face criminal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Emma anticipated that someone might use my grief and age as opportunities for financial exploitation. She prepared legal consequences that would teach valuable lessons about the difference between family concern and family theft, I said to Brad. Brad read the document with growing horror as he realized that his emergency guardianship petition had triggered criminal penalties that would destroy him even more completely than bankruptcy. Frank, I never meant for it to go this far. I just thought I could solve our financial problems while helping you get appropriate care, Brad said. Brad, you meant for it to go exactly this far. You planned to steal my farm while telling everyone you were protecting me from unsafe living conditions, I replied. The next morning brought news that completed Brad's destruction. James Crawford called to report that Dr. Harrison had withdrawn his competency evaluation after reviewing Emma's trust documents and understanding his legal exposure for participating in fraudulent medical proceedings. Frank, the court dismissed Brad's emergency guardianship petition based on Dr. Harrison's reversal and the evidence of financial motivation you provided, James said. But there's more news you need to know. James explained that the trust's automatic triggers had activated criminal investigations into Brad's business practices, competency fraud, and attempted elder abuse. The same legal mechanisms Emma had designed to protect my farm were now ensuring that Brad faced complete consequences for his attempted theft. Frank, your wife's planning was remarkable in its foresight and thoroughness. Brad's going to face criminal charges, civil liability, and professional sanctions that will follow him for the rest of his life, James said. That afternoon, Sarah came to the farm with tears in her eyes and divorce papers in her hand. Dad, I'm sorry I almost let him steal your home. I should have seen what Brad was really doing, she said. Sarah, you were being manipulated by someone who used your love for me as a weapon against both of us. Emma prepared legal protections because she understood that good people can be deceived by skilled manipulators, I replied. We sat in Emma's kitchen where Sarah had eaten breakfast before school for 18 years, where she'd learned values about honesty and hard work that Brad had tried to exploit for his financial schemes. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now you rebuild your life without someone who saw our family as a financial opportunity. And I continue living in the house Emma and I built together, protected by legal arrangements she made because she loved us both too much to let us be stolen from, I said. That evening, I walked through the fields Emma and I had cultivated for 47 years, thinking about the trust she'd established to preserve our life's work and protect my independence from people who would mistake vulnerability for opportunity. Brad's education about the difference between family loyalty and financial exploitation was complete. Emma's final gift to our family was the wisdom to recognize threats disguised as concern and the legal tools to defeat them decisively. Some people only learn through complete consequences. Some education can only be provided by people who prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Emma had done both, protecting everything we'd built while teaching valuable lessons about respect, honesty, and the true meaning of family love. The weeks following Brad's failed guardianship attempt unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche of consequences that Emma's trust had set in motion. Each day brought new revelations about the scope of his deception and the legal mechanisms my wife had prepared to punish exactly the kind of betrayal he'd attempted. Detective Sarah Martinez from the Elder Abuse Unit arrived at my farm on a Tuesday morning with questions about Brad's systematic campaign to have me declared incompetent. Mr. Morrison, we're investigating your son-in-law for attempted fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit theft, Detective Martinez said. What specific crimes are you looking at? I asked her. Brad Webb filed false reports claiming you were mentally incompetent and living in unsafe conditions. He attempted to manipulate medical professionals into providing fraudulent competency evaluations. He also tried to use forged documents to support his emergency guardianship petition, Detective Martinez explained. She showed me evidence that the trust's automatic investigation triggers had uncovered. Brad had been far more systematic in his deception than I'd realized, creating a paper trail of fabricated incidents and falsified medical concerns designed to build a legal case for my incompetence. Mr. Morrison, your wife's trust included provisions that automatically notified law enforcement when fraudulent guardianship proceedings were initiated, Detective Martinez said. Those notifications triggered investigations that revealed the full scope of your son-in-law's criminal activities. Emma's foresight was even more remarkable than I'd understood. She'd not only prepared legal defenses against theft, she'd created automatic mechanisms that would ensure criminal prosecution of anyone who attempted to exploit my vulnerability for financial gain. 3 days later, James Crawford called with news that completed the picture of Brad's destruction. Frank, the State Real Estate Commission is revoking Brad's license based on evidence of client fund misappropriation, James said. They've also referred his case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. How much money did he steal from clients? I asked James. Preliminary investigation suggests over $50,000 diverted from escrow accounts to personal use, primarily gambling debts and luxury purchases, James said. Combined with the elder abuse charges related to his attempt on your farm, Brad's looking at significant prison time. But the most devastating consequence came from an unexpected source. Mr. Henderson, the farmer whose property bordered mine to the south, stopped by that afternoon with information that made Brad's situation hopeless. Frank, I thought you should know that Brad approached me 3 months ago about selling my land, Henderson said, as we sat on my front porch watching storm clouds build over the cornfields. He claimed you were planning to sell your farm and suggested I do the same so he could package both properties for a development deal. What did you tell him? I asked Henderson. I told him I'd need to talk to you directly before considering any sale. Brad said that might not be possible due to your declining mental state, but he'd handle all the negotiations, Henderson said. Brad hadn't been content with stealing my farm. He'd been planning to use my supposed incompetence as leverage to acquire neighboring properties for a development scheme that would have destroyed the agricultural character of our entire area. Frank, Brad showed me architectural plans for a shopping center and housing development that would cover both our farms plus the Patterson property to the east, Henderson continued. He said he had investors lined up and just needed to secure the land through family connections and estate planning services. The scope of Brad's greed was staggering. He'd envisioned converting hundreds of acres of productive farmland into commercial development, using my medical vulnerability as the foundation for a scheme that would have enriched him while destroying the rural community Emma and I had spent our lives preserving. That evening, Sarah came to dinner at the farm for the first time since discovering Brad's true nature. She looked older but more peaceful, as if the stress of living with a systematic liar had been lifted from her shoulders. "Dad, I found something in Brad's home office that you need to see," Sarah said as she helped me clear the dishes from Emma's kitchen table. She pulled out a folder labeled Morrison Development Project that contained architectural drawings, financial projections, and correspondence with real estate investors. The documents revealed that Brad had been planning his theft of my farm for over 2 years, long before Emma's death had made me vulnerable to manipulation. He'd identified my property as the centerpiece of a development scheme that would generate millions in profit if he could gain control through guardianship proceedings. "Sarah, how long had Brad been working on this?" I asked my daughter. "According to the dates on these documents, he started researching guardianship laws and development potential right after Mom's cancer diagnosis," Sarah said. "He was planning to steal your farm while she was still alive." The revelation that Brad had been scheming to exploit my grief while Emma was fighting for her life made me understand why she'd been so thorough in establishing legal protections against him. "Dad, there's something else you should know," Sarah said. "I found evidence that Brad has been borrowing money against our house, our cars, even my jewelry. Everything we own is collateral for gambling debts and failed business ventures." Sarah explained that Brad's financial desperation was even worse than the investigators had discovered. He owed money not just to banks and legitimate creditors, but to loan sharks and gambling syndicates that expected immediate payment or inflicted physical consequences. "He wasn't just trying to steal your farm to avoid bankruptcy, Dad. He was trying to avoid people who would hurt our family if he couldn't pay them back," Sarah said. The knowledge that Brad's scheme had been motivated by threats against Sarah and Katie made his betrayal even more despicable. He'd been willing to steal my life's work and destroy my independence to solve problems he'd created through gambling addiction and criminal business practices. 2 weeks later, Brad was arrested at his office while meeting with clients whose escrow funds he'd been stealing to pay gambling debts. The arrest was coordinated with raids on his home and business that uncovered evidence of systematic fraud spanning 3 years. "Mr. Morrison, your son-in-law is facing 15 felony charges," Detective Martinez reported when she called with updates. "Elder abuse, attempted fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and multiple counts of theft by conversion." "What kind of sentence is he looking at?" I asked Detective Martinez. "With his criminal history and the scope of his crimes, probably 8 to 12 years in state prison. Plus civil liability for all the money he stole and attempted to steal," she said. But the most satisfying consequence came from the trust mechanisms Emma had prepared for exactly this scenario. The attempted guardianship fraud had triggered automatic penalties that transferred significant portions of Brad's remaining assets to a fund for elder abuse prevention. "Frank, your wife's trust included provisions that anyone who attempted to steal your farm through fraudulent proceedings would forfeit their personal assets to charity," James Crawford explained. "Brad's house, cars, and business assets are being liquidated to fund programs that protect elderly people from exactly the kind of exploitation he attempted." Emma's final lesson for Brad was that stealing from family doesn't just destroy relationships, it triggers consequences that follow criminals long after their victims have been protected and their schemes have been exposed. 6 months after Brad's arrest, Sarah brought Katie home from college for the first extended visit since Emma's death. We spent the weekend walking through the fields Emma had loved, discussing plans for maintaining the farm and preserving the agricultural traditions she'd valued. "Grandpa, I've been thinking about changing my major to agricultural law," Katie said as we sat on the porch swing Emma and I had shared for 27 years. "I want to help other farming families protect their land from people like Brad." "What would that involve?" I asked Katie. "Learning how to set up legal protections like the trust Grandma created, helping elderly farmers recognize manipulation and exploitation before it's too late. Teaching families how to balance care and concern with respect for independence," Katie said. Katie's decision to dedicate her career to protecting agricultural families from financial exploitation was the most meaningful tribute to Emma's memory I could have imagined. My granddaughter had learned from Brad's attempted theft that some people need legal boundaries to remind them about moral obligations. A year after Brad's conviction, I received a letter from him in state prison. The letter was part of a court-ordered restitution program that required him to acknowledge his crimes and attempt to make amends to his victims. "Frank," Brad wrote, "I know I can't undo the damage I caused to our family or excuse the crimes I committed against you. But I want you to know that prison has taught me something important about the difference between needing help and stealing what you can't earn." Brad explained that addiction counseling and financial therapy had helped him understand how gambling addiction had justified increasingly criminal behavior, including his systematic plan to steal my farm while convincing Sarah and himself that he was protecting my welfare. "I spent 2 years planning to steal your life's work while telling myself I was helping you transition to appropriate care," Brad wrote. "Prison has taught me that addiction doesn't excuse betrayal and that desperation doesn't justify destroying the people who trusted you." The letter concluded with an acknowledgement that his crimes had consequences extending far beyond his own imprisonment. Sarah's divorce, Katie's education costs, the loss of family relationships, and the destruction of trust that would follow him after his release from prison. I never replied to Brad's letter, but I kept it as a reminder that Emma's trust had achieved exactly what she'd intended: complete consequences for someone who'd attempted complete betrayal, delivered with the precision and thoroughness that characterized everything she'd ever planned. 3 years after the failed guardianship attempt, I still live in the farmhouse. Emma and I built together, still manage the agricultural operations we developed over 4 decades, still make my own decisions about housing and property management. Sarah visits regularly, sometimes bringing her children to learn about farming and family history from their grandfather. She's rebuilding her life without the stress of living with someone whose financial desperation had made every family relationship a potential source of money. Katie graduated with her law degree and specializes in protecting elderly property owners from exploitation by family members and business associates. She's helped dozens of farming families establish trusts and legal protections similar to what Emma created to preserve my independence. The farm that Brad tried to steal through fraudulent guardianship proceedings continues to produce corn and soybeans, exactly as Emma and I had planned when we bought this land 47 years ago. The fields he'd planned to convert into shopping centers and housing developments remain agricultural, protected by legal mechanisms that ensure they'll stay farmland regardless of future family pressures. Brad's education about the difference between family concern and family theft cost him everything he'd claimed to be protecting. His marriage, his career, his freedom, his relationship with Sarah and Katie, and any claim to benefiting from the agricultural legacy he'd tried to liquidate for gambling money. Some people only learn through complete consequences. Some education can only be provided by people who prepare for the worst betrayals while hoping for the best outcomes. Emma had done both, protecting our family's future while teaching expensive lessons about respect, honesty, and the true cost of mistaking vulnerability for opportunity. The lesson had been worth every year. Brad spent learning it in state prison, every asset he'd forfeited to elder abuse prevention programs, and every relationship he'd destroyed through crimes disguised as family planning. 5 years after Brad's sentencing, I received a letter that made Emma's legacy complete. The letter was from the Morrison Agricultural Preservation Trust, the foundation Katie had established using the assets forfeited from Brad's criminal activities. They were writing to thank me for the donation that had allowed the trust to protect over 40 farming families from similar exploitation attempts. Your wife's vision of protecting agricultural heritage from financial predators has transformed how we approach elder advocacy in rural communities, the foundation director wrote. The Morrison farm has become a model for legal protections that preserve both family independence and agricultural traditions. I was sitting on the front porch reading the letter when Katie's truck pulled into the driveway. My granddaughter, now 26, and a successful agricultural attorney, came for Sunday dinner every week, just as Sarah had done when she was growing up on this farm. "Hi, Grandpa," Katie said, walking across the yard with the confident stride of someone who'd found her calling in protecting families like ours. "How are you feeling about the ceremony next week?" The ceremony was the dedication of the Morrison Agricultural Training Center, a facility that would teach sustainable farming practices to young veterans transitioning from military service to agricultural careers. Built with funding from the restitution Brad's crimes had generated, the center represented Emma's vision of converting attempted theft into lasting service. "I'm proud that something good came from what Brad tried to do to us," I told Katie as we settled into the chairs Emma and I had chosen together 51 years earlier. Katie had inherited Emma's wisdom about balancing justice with compassion, punishment with education. "Grandma's trust didn't just protect you and the farm, Grandpa, it created a model that other families could use to protect themselves from financial exploitation," she said. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the corn grow in fields that Brad had planned to convert into shopping centers. The same fields where Katie was now implementing regenerative farming techniques she'd learned during her agricultural law studies. Katie asked me how I felt about Sarah's upcoming visit with her new husband, David, a teacher she'd met during the community college courses she'd taken to rebuild her career after Brad's conviction. "Your mother deserves happiness with someone who values her for who she is, not what she can provide access to," I said to Katie. Sarah had spent 3 difficult years recovering from the trauma of discovering that her marriage had been built on lies and financial manipulation. The therapy and education she'd pursued during that time had taught her to recognize the difference between love and exploitation, between family concern and family theft. "Mom's different now," Katie said. "Stronger, more careful about trusting people's motives but not cynical. David's good for her because he has his own career and his own values." 6 months later, the Agricultural Training Center held its first graduation ceremony. 23 veterans had completed the program, learning skills that would allow them to manage small farms, work for agricultural cooperatives, or establish their own sustainable farming operations. This program exists because someone tried to steal a farm and discovered that some families prepare for exactly that kind of betrayal, I said during my remarks to the graduating class. I explained how Emma's trust had not only protected our family's agricultural heritage, but had created mechanisms that converted Brad's attempted theft into funding for programs that served people who'd earned support through military service rather than people who demanded support through family manipulation. The land that Brad Webb tried to steal through fraudulent guardianship proceedings now trains veterans in agricultural skills that will serve them and their communities for decades, I continued. After the ceremony, Sarah approached me with tears in her eyes and David at her side. "Dad, I want you to know how proud I am that you protected the farm from what Brad was trying to do," she said. "And I want you to know how sorry I am that I almost helped him steal your life's work," Sarah continued. "If you hadn't been strong enough to resist his manipulation, we would have lost everything Mom and you built together." Sarah was right. Emma's trust had protected the farm legally, but I'd had to protect it practically by recognizing Brad's manipulation and refusing to surrender to pressure disguised as concern. "Sarah, Brad was skilled at using people's love as weapons against them. You were being manipulated by someone who'd studied your caring nature and figured out how to exploit it," I said to my daughter. "But you saw through his lies," she replied. "Emma saw through his lies. I just had the wisdom to implement the protection she prepared for exactly what Brad was planning," I said. 2 years after the training center dedication, I decided to visit Brad in prison. Not to forgive him or offer reconciliation, but to understand whether his punishment had taught him anything meaningful about the consequences of betraying family trust. Brad appeared in the visiting room wearing prison uniforms that made him look smaller and older than I remembered. His face carried the drawn appearance of someone who'd lost weight and gained perspective in equal measure. "Frank, thank you for coming," Brad said as we sat across from each other at a plastic table designed to prevent the exchange of contraband or comfort. "How are you doing, Brad?" I asked. "Learning things I should have figured out years before I tried to steal your farm," Brad replied. "Like the difference between asking for help and taking what you think you're entitled to." Brad explained that prison addiction counseling had helped him understand how gambling addiction had justified increasingly criminal behavior, but that addiction didn't excuse the systematic planning and manipulation he'd used against me and Sarah. The counselors made me write letters to everyone I'd hurt during my criminal activities. Apologizing, accepting responsibility, promising never to repeat the behaviors that caused damage, Brad said. "I wrote you and Sarah dozens of letters over the past 3 years, but I never sent them. Because what I did wasn't just about gambling addiction, it was about entitlement and greed that I'd been hiding behind family concern," Brad continued. I listened as my former son-in-law finally articulated the moral bankruptcy that had driven him to attempt stealing my farm while convincing Sarah and himself that he was protecting my welfare. "Frank, I convinced myself that you were too old to make good decisions about the farm and that I was smart enough to manage it better than you could," Brad said. "So you decided to steal it through fraudulent medical claims instead of earning the right to be involved in its management," I replied. "I decided that my financial problems were more important than your independence and that Sarah's worry about you could be weaponized into stealing your life's work," Brad said. The honesty was brutal but necessary. Brad had learned that addiction might explain destructive behavior, but it didn't excuse criminal behavior, and that desperation might motivate terrible choices, but it didn't justify them. "What happens when you get out?" I asked Brad. "I start over somewhere else, doing work that doesn't involve access to other people's money or decision-making authority that affects their lives," Brad replied. "Sarah divorced me 3 years ago, not because she stopped loving me, but because I destroyed her ability to trust me with our family's financial security and moral foundation," Brad continued. The consequences were complete and permanent. Brad had lost his marriage, his relationship with Katie, his professional reputation, and his freedom. The farm he'd tried to steal had been preserved exactly as Emma and I had planned, while his crimes had generated funding for programs that served people who'd earned help through service rather than demanded help through manipulation. As I drove home from the prison, I reflected on the man Brad had become through consequences Emma had designed to be educational rather than merely punitive. He seemed genuinely different, humbled by experiences that had taught him the real cost of confusing desperation with justification. But change motivated by punishment is different from change motivated by principle, and trust shattered by systematic betrayal can't be rebuilt through apologies delivered from prison cells. 3 years later, I celebrated my 80th birthday, surrounded by family who understood the difference between loving someone and enabling their destructive behavior toward others. Sarah and David brought their children to learn about farming and family values from their grandfather. Katie brought updates about the agricultural preservation work she was doing with families across 3 states. The farmhouse where Emma and I had raised Sarah, where we planned for retirement years we thought we'd share together, remained exactly as we'd envisioned it. a place where agricultural traditions were preserved, where family values were taught, and where the land continued to produce food rather than being converted to commercial development. The fields that Brad had planned to turn into shopping centers and housing developments were now managed by Katie using sustainable practices that would preserve their productivity for future generations. The trust Emma had established to protect our farm from financial predators had become a model for other agricultural families facing similar threats. Brad's attempted theft had been converted into lasting education about the difference between family concern and family exploitation, between needing help and stealing what you can't earn, between addiction as explanation and criminality as choice. Emma's final gift to our family was the wisdom to recognize manipulation disguised as concern, the legal tools to defeat systematic theft, and the strength to impose consequences that would teach valuable lessons about respect, honesty, and the true cost of betraying family trust. The lesson had been expensive for Brad, but worth every year he'd spent learning it. Some people only understand respect after they've permanently forfeited any claim to it. Some education can only be provided by people who prepare for the worst betrayals while hoping for better outcomes. Emma had prepared for both possibilities, protecting our family's future while ensuring that anyone who attempted to exploit our vulnerability would face consequences that matched the scope of their betrayal. The Morrison farm continues to thrive under management that understands the difference between stewardship and ownership, between preserving agricultural heritage and liquidating it for short-term financial gain. Some mornings, when the light hits the cornfields just right, I can almost see Emma walking among the rows she'd helped plant, satisfied that her planning had preserved everything we'd built together while teaching expensive lessons to people who'd confused our age with our weakness. I hope this story touched you, especially those protecting agricultural heritage and family independence from people who see elder vulnerability as financial opportunity rather than a time requiring genuine care and respect. If this story moved you, please support our channel with a like and subscribe for more stories about family manipulation, elder advocacy, and the courage to protect what you've built from those who would exploit your trust during vulnerable moments. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts, or let us know where you're listening from around the world. These stories about family, farming, and protecting life's work from exploitation connect people across all cultures and communities. Thank you for joining this journey through family betrayal, legal protection, and the wisdom that comes from understanding the difference between helping someone and stealing from them when they're grieving and vulnerable. Until next time, remember, the most valuable legacy isn't property or money, but the principles guiding how we treat family members who trust us with their life's work, and the strength to protect those principles even when protection requires difficult decisions about people who claim to love us.